Thank you all very much for joining us. My name is Bob Schindler. I'm one of the attorneys here at Miller Johnson, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of our Conversations for Change series. For anyone that may just be hearing about Conversations for Change and what that is, it's an initiative that Miller Johnson began in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd and the civil unrest and social movements that followed. In the wake of that, Miller Johnson wanted to do more than just a corporate statement. And so one of the initiatives that we began was we created this series to have conversations that will hopefully open minds on topics that are often left unsaid, and conversations that will educate us about differences, but with the goal of really trying to bring us together. If you would like to learn more about these conversations, I would encourage you to venture to Miller Johnson's YouTube page after this webinar is over, of course, and watch the videos we have there. And so now we have had these conversations going, moving into 2021. The firm really wanted to sort of begin to grow the scope of some of these conversations that we were having, and the one we're talking about today seemed to be the natural next step. As you hopefully know, May was Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Moreover, if you're in tune at all to the news, you may not know about Asian punk bands like me, but you probably have heard about growing concerns and incidences of anti-Asian hate crime. From the mass shooting that we had in Atlanta to individual attacks on Asian Americans, especially in large cities throughout the country. This has been a growing concern and problem. But while this may be a new talking point, the issues that these incidences arise from are not new. And so we wanted to have this conversation to begin to talk about that. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the women who will be having our conversation today and sharing their research, their life experiences with us and trying to move this conversation forward. We are lucky to be joined by Kim McLaughlin, who is the Vice President of Organizational Development and Engagement for Wolverine Building Group. In that role, she's responsible for the company marketing, employee engagement, leadership development, and strategic direction. She also serves on the executive committee for Mercy Health St. Mary's Foundation, Habitat for Humanity of Kent County, the City of Grand Rapids Brownfield Authority, and I know she's very excited to be leading the committee for Grand Rapids to become sister cities with Gangnam-gu, South Korea. Joining her in this conversation is Kim Bellware. Kim was raised in Kalamazoo, but is now a reporter for the Washington Post based out of Chicago and Washington, D.C., more so Chicago now. She covers national breaking news and writes features for the Post. Prior to working for the Washington Post, Kim was a reporter for the Huffington Post and a freelance writer that wrote stories for the New York Times, Rolling Stones, Vice News, and many other outlets that you've probably heard of as well. So without further ado, I want to thank both of you really for being here for this conversation. And it is my pleasure to turn the conversation over to you ladies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we'll go right into it. A lot of what Bob was saying is, this is exactly right. The issues that we're talking about now and this raised awareness of hate crimes against Asians and Asian American Pacific Islanders. These are something that are in the headlines. These are in headlines that I write. But the concerns from the community are not new, and the issues are not new. And so I thought it would be some useful context to go through and sort of see how some of what we are dealing with in the current moment really mirrors the very beginning of the history of Asians and Asian Americans in the United States, because that's really shaped a lot of that's kind of set the course for what we're dealing with now. And some of these things you might be familiar with, some of them might be new to you. But, if we go back, the first 100 years of Asians in the United States, and this goes back to 1785. The very first Chinese immigrant arrives in Baltimore. So there is a long time sort of stereotype that a lot of Asians and American-born Asian Americans deal with, where maybe because of our faces or because of the really strong cultural cues of language, of food, there's an assumption often treated like a perpetual foreigner, that we must be new here, that, the where are you from, those kinds of questions get to the idea that, we can never be American, that we always have to be new. And when we look back at the history, the first Chinese immigrant was here before most of the wave of Eastern European immigrants that came later in the 1800s and 1900s. But after that, after the late 1780s, we start seeing, some kind of different levels of comfort and how some anti-Asian xenophobic biases start to take root. We have a Naturalization Act just a couple years later. In 1834, the first woman comes, and it's her name, as we know, is Afong Moy, and she's brought from Guangzhou to New York City, and she is exhibited around the country as a carnival exhibit. And local papers, some of them called her Julia Fuchi Ching Chang King. So you can hear probably in that entire sentence a lot of problems of, the exotic, the mysterious, unknowable, exotic Asian woman, mangling of native language and, kind of the ways that names can be bastardized. And now, even in this name that newspapers gave this woman, who was treated not as a person, but as a fascination, as a literal carnival exhibit, that really gets to this dehumanization, this exotification. And, we're seeing them as a curiosity. We're seeing these people from another country as a curiosity and not as human beings who have interior lives or who have names that we should bother to learn and pronounce correctly. Later on in mid-century of the 1800s, we start to get the expansion of the railroads. And something that has always fascinated me about the history of Asian immigrant laborers, particularly Chinese laborers, is if you go back into the archives, it's really hard to find photos of them at work. And I finally came across one. I want to say it was maybe at the Smithsonian or the National Archives. They talked about how after the railroads were built, when they were ready to take the pictures, they asked all of the Chinese people to step out of the picture. So they are literally erased from the work that they did, building parts of the railroad out west. And this again goes to this erasure, this idea that Asians have been part of this country, have had a hand in building this country, but those achievements and those contributions were not always recorded, were not always included because they weren't the people in power. And this goes back to the idea of who gets to tell the stories and who gets to write the history really just has such a huge impact on the history that we ended up learning in our schools in West Michigan growing up, whenever it was that whichever decade you grew up in West Michigan. We get later into the 1870s with the Naturalization Act, barring Chinese from obtaining US citizenship. Women can't immigrate without their husbands. And then a couple of years later came the Page Act. And the Page Act was interesting because this came up a lot after the Atlanta spa shootings, where historians were talking about that. This act was specifically around banning Chinese women, and it was ostensibly to prevent prostitution. And so if we go back for, about, the entire 1870s, where there was a lot of immigrants coming, particularly out west, to work in the railroads and to do labor, there was a perception created by the news is often complicit in this, created by the news and created by politicians of this foreigner, this yellow peril, moral degenerates. They're not like us. They look different, they talk different, they eat different, they have a different culture. And so this othering kind of calcified into this idea that Asians were moral degenerates and not good for healthy society, and that women were probably prostitutes if they were coming over. And that is something that has been criticized as we go through and look at the ongoing perceptions of Asian women, how they are often hypersexualized or seen as one-dimensional. And it kind of starts with this Page Act. And these are all acts that were, that were approved by the federal government. These were not necessarily just state level legislation. This was the U.S. government, making these choices. A couple of years later, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which more people are familiar with, which bans men. And the U.S. keeps all of these exclusion laws, at least against Chinese, in place until World War II, when it became politically expedient, because then China was an ally against Japan. And in World War II, of the entire Chinese American population, 20% of that population of the U.S. was drafted. And that's another thing, when we think of Veterans Day, how often are we looking at the contributions of these groups of people who weren't even allowed to become citizens, who were still serving the country? And that takes us into the 20th century, where for 100 years, Asian immigrants have been seen as stealing jobs. They're undercutting laborers who are working out west. They are not easily integrating into society. And these are just outsiders. They don't fit in. And then when we get to the 1950s, things dramatically change for Asian Americans. And that is going to get us into something that you have all probably heard of, which is the model minority myth. And one of the times I can remember in my lifetime of hearing of the model minority myth was a 1987 Time magazine cover. I was too young, but I saw the cover later on as I got older. And it was a cover that said the new whiz kids, and it was focusing on the ultra academically successful Asian and Asian immigrant kids, and mostly Japanese, Korean, what they called Indo-Chinese. So I wanted to now move over to Kim and talk about, how did the model minority myth first manifest in your life in particular, and what was that like?
Thanks, Kim. I do want to touch real quickly on one thing with the history piece that I think is also really important to share with everybody today. And that is that currently there is no standard US curriculum for Asian American history here being taught. And really what is included are the milestones that are related to World War II and the internment of the Japanese here in the United States. But many of the facts and history that you just shared with everybody, I think this is probably the first time that a lot of people have heard about any of those acts or any of that history related to our country. Now moving forward to model minority myth and what you were talking about. I remember the whiz kids because I am a product of the 80s. And the model minority myth did, it manifested very, very early for me in my life. There's an organization called Launch, which stands for Leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change. And they did a poll that was asking people 3 adjectives to describe Asian Americans. And the leading answers from respondents were smart and intelligent, hardworking, kind, nice, and thoughtful. And these are consistent stereotypes that Asians have had in America over the past 50 years. And, the responses to these tied directly into, my first experience with the model minority myth. And what's interesting is I'm a Korean adoptee. So I have white parents, I have a white brother. And my first experience with this is when I was being tested to see if I was ready for kindergarten. And I grew up in the Forest Hills area here in West Michigan and, was going through the testing. And at the time, my mother was taking Spanish lessons. And, I was 4 years old and she was teaching me basic Spanish as she's practicing Spanish. And I go into the kindergarten pre-test and they say, can you count to 10? And I counted to 10. And then I said to the woman, would you like me to do it in Spanish? And, here I was, just this sassy young, toddler. But the woman was like, oh, wait, we have a prodigy. Called my mother, I think we need to go and get your child tested for advanced IQ testing. And you know what, it really was, we've learned now that it's so much easier for children at a young age to pick up a second language. But back then in the 80s, this is the first time I was one of only a few Asian kids at my school, at Pine Ridge School. So the evaluator, she was not very familiar, with seeing different minorities coming in through the school system. And that was the very first impression that she had, simply because I said I could, count to 10 in Spanish. The second time I think that sticks out to me with the model minority myth is my brother was attending Michigan State University, and he had some friends that were home visiting. And I was in high school at the time, and I was telling one of his friends that I was really hoping that I was going to be going to Michigan State as well. And his friend, not knowing me at all, he said to me, "Oh, I assumed you were probably going to go to an Ivy League school," which also I think plays back into the smart, intelligent, minority myth. And, my parents and I think we've had some good laughs off of this. Like, I was a good student. I was not an exceptional student, but definitely this is something that has impacted me, from that respect ever since I was a young child. But, the model minority myth, Kim, I think that has actually materialized into a lot most recently related to other minorities in our communities, and has been a pretty, hot topic for discussion. And I was wondering, if you just wanted to talk a little bit about, how that has created almost a racial wedge sometimes for the Asian community among other minority communities.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that I will say too. Again, I'm not sure what everybody on the call, on the Zoom, kind of what what the context is, what you're coming to this conversation already knowing. But I would say, this part that I'm going to talk about as far as the racial wedge of the model minority myth, I only learned of this maybe in the last 5 years. And this is very much the intersection of things that I'm both personally interested and also things that I cover with issues of race, class, gender, and communities. And so, if you are hearing this for the first time, that is okay. Don't let it be the last time you hear things like this. So I just want to put that out there. But, this idea, something that I hear so often is, when there is pushback and criticism and unpacking of why the model minority myth is harmful, a lot of people say, but it's a good one. You have a good stereotype. Your stereotype isn't that you're, lazy or entitled or, greedy or whatever it might be. Your stereotype is that you're smart and you're industrious. What's wrong with that? Aren't I giving you a compliment? I'm stereotyping you positively. I'm of the mind that stereotypes in general get us away from understanding and interacting with people as individuals and not as, a monolithic group. And Asians especially are not monolithic of, more than 50 languages, more than a dozen religions, 100 different ethnic identities. So it is a diverse group, and the model minority stereotype really flattens people. It definitely erases the struggles of what within the community we sometimes just say like our brown Asians, some groups like Laotian immigrants, for example, have some of the highest rates of poverty. They have some of the highest rates of drug addiction. And when you think of a group as universally successful and high achieving in education, it can be very easy to overlook and ignore issues that other parts of that diaspora are grappling with. But what was so fascinating to me was looking at, when I did that little nutshell history lesson of how roughly 100+ years of Asians in the United States had been generally treated with suspicion or fear or as a threat. Something really interesting happens between the 40s and the 70s, which is, kind of right around bookending the main part of the civil rights era. And a lot of this is based on a Brown University economist research, Nathaniel Hilger. I'm a reporter, so I like to cite my sources. But during this 30-year time period in the 40s to the 70s, Asian Americans not only surpassed African Americans in average household earnings, but they also closed the wage gap with whites. And a lot of people who, again, reporters and other academics and people who were looking at this, they credited this rise with Asians being, industrious. This is something that as a group, as an ethnic group, they did better. And what Hilger's research found was that nothing changed about the education rates of Asians. It's that policies in the country became less racist and less marginalizing towards these groups. So you see a lot of access opening up as far as immigration. You see much more positive narratives coming out. And, there's countless newspaper articles that you can find in the 50s and 60s that really glorify Asian Americans as industrious, as law-abiding. They keep their heads down and never complain. And that is another thing of kind of the silent model minority that gets praised. Asians are often stereotyped as not being political and not being engaged in the wider community. And, there's also people who think that racism towards Asians diminished because Asians had proved themselves by, proving that they could, be good Americans. And some of that is survival. We saw that a lot with Japanese Americans after World War II, being part of, being good citizens was a way to prove that they were patriots, that they were Americans and they belonged here. But, if you look at, there's a lot of historians have been looking at this. And so much of why Asians in particular were elevated, it's tangled up in politics, in the civil rights movement and the Cold War. This is an area that for me personally is really fascinating. But during the Cold War and things like the space race, one of the weak spots that the Soviets were able to very effectively hammer the United States on is that the United States was racist. They could just look at the newspapers and say, look at how a free and democratic society, this is so great. Look at how they treat people in their own country. Look at what's happening to, African Americans of this country. This is why the first cosmonaut, side note, in space was a Afro-Cuban, because they were able to say, the Soviets are, we're truly about equality and about diversity. And so as a way to deflect criticisms during the Cold War that the US was, treating its different racial minorities unequally, it eased up and elevated Asian Americans, but it also was a very effective cudgel because in the 1940s, as African Americans were also trying to do investment, trying to, show that they're patriotic and industrious and take part of that post-war boom, there's also the civil rights movement. And it was a lot easier to divide these groups and say, Asians are successful because they are, look, these are good minorities. You guys are bad minorities. Look at you protesting and, demanding things that we don't want to give you. And so it was really easy to drive a wedge between these racial groups and use one as a way to kind of hold down another. And you see this play out often when talking, especially to denigrate non-Asian minority groups. It's easy to point to Asians and say, it's, not all minorities are this way. Why can't you be more like Asians? And that is something that most Asians want nothing to do with. I don't want to say most, because I can't speak for that. But that is a very fascinating thing, in seeing how really to kind of wedge and tamp down some of the, the rising movement around this, around civil rights. It was easy to show that, elevate one group and kind of push one to the front of the line to show that, if you can give somebody priority and, they thrive, it's easy to point to that success and, kind of make some other not so accurate assumptions on that. So that is, that is a pretty fascinating part of how that myth got started. It was not, it's one that, in looking back through history, appears to be one that was very engineered.
So, you made a comment around the myth and the comparison to other minority groups, and, Asians don't want that comparison to be there. Which has sort of actually evolved a little bit into another topic that I think we wanted to talk about, related to colorblindness. Kim, do you want to, start out and talk a little bit about you growing up in Southwest Michigan and what that was like for you?
Yeah, this is another thing. Growing up in Kalamazoo, I went to Kalamazoo Central. There was not a very big Asian population. It was mostly split, about 50-50 black and white. And in my elementary school, there were no Asian kids either. And it can be a pretty lonely feeling. And Kim and I had discussed this previously. I think this is also a little more unique to the Midwest. I think for Asians and Asian Americans who grow up on the West Coast, in California and Oregon and, Nevada, where there is a larger community, it's a little easier to have your ethnic community be more part of the dominant culture. That is not so much the case in Kalamazoo in the 1980s. And, I would often feel like kind of nobody is claiming me because the white kids did not see me as white and the black kids obviously did not see me as black. But Asian wasn't really something that a lot of people saw. And, the other thing is, when I look back and try and understand these experiences and understanding how people behaved as, maybe a product of the time, I don't agree with that as an excuse all the time, but sometimes it is true. I think it wasn't until I was maybe in middle school that on every single form that I had to check for school or some government form, that there was an actual box for me to check. I mean, a lot of these, we were so slow to identify different groups. If you took the census last year, you probably saw that there was way more options. That did not exist in like the 1980s census. So, another thing to point out right now is that our understanding of diasporas and of different groups is constantly changing, and it is really important to recognize these different identities. There's also a lot of discussion that Asian American is itself a really clumsy term because that includes all of South Asia, all of East Asia, the Middle East. And if you say Asian American, are you thinking of somebody from Lebanon? Or are you thinking of someone from China? So Asian is huge. And it encompasses so much, yet it's something that is very easy for people to, not always see. And something that Kim and I discussed both hearing is people saying, probably in a well-meaning way, that they didn't see us as Asian, that they were colorblind. And, it might have been a way to be inviting, saying, I don't see you as different. But this is not necessarily helpful. So Kim, I wanted to throw it back to you. What is the difficulty with telling Asian Americans or really any ethnic group that you don't see their race?
Well, so this is, I think this taps into, I was at a Talent 2025 event here in Grand Rapids. For the people in Grand Rapids, you're familiar with Talent 2025 and some of their diversity initiatives. And I was sitting at a table with some people and we were having a discussion around race, and somebody said, well, I'm colorblind. And, we talked through the concept there, but for everybody that's on the video today, I just want to share with you a little bit of history around the roots of colorblind racism. And really this started as a good intention. And they say that most of the roots of this really came from the last third of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, when he said he wants people to see his kids for the context of their character, not the color of their skin. And so, when I hear a white person say that they're colorblind, I truly believe that there's great intentions behind all of that, that they, just really don't want color to be the primary lens in which they're judging a person's character. But really, what colorblindness does is it denies the lived experience of others. And for me, I have a short story I want to share with you that recently happened to me at work. And I work for a construction company, which is, the construction industry is dominated by white males. And I work with a lot of white males. And I was having a conversation with one of our superintendents who I have a great working relationship with. We have come from very different backgrounds, but really enjoy, the camaraderie that I have with him. And we were talking just randomly about, what are you going to do this weekend? And he told me that he was going to go and take his mother to get her concealed weapons license. And I was like, asking him about it. And then I said to him, I was like, well, maybe I should go and get my concealed weapons license because of all the Asian hate crimes that are going on right now. And he paused, and it was a long pause. And then he said to me, he's like, yeah, but you don't have to worry about that. why are you worried about that? And, you know, reflecting back on it, it was, I don't know if he was saying that because he, you know, didn't look at me at the color of my skin and was looking at me as the character of who I am, or if it was just going back to, I don't see Asians, right, as color. And I think this is just one thing, you know, that I really feel pretty passionate about when people say that they're colorblind, is for them to understand that we know that the intentions behind that are probably coming from a really good place, but what it really is doing is that it's denying that people of color are living a different experience today. And I think that that's, you know, one thing around the Asian hate crimes here in West Michigan is that, well, exactly what Kim said, you know, these aren't happening here as much in our backyard. Still, there's been over, I think, 6,000 Asian hate crimes that have happened in this country in the past year. And it is affecting people because we are just living a different experience right now because of that. But I could go on on this topic, but there is a topic that I really am excited to talk about as well. And I want to hear from Kim around this because this is something that is pretty current in the news. And you recently did do an article related to invisible labor that was tied into the deadly spot shootings that happened in Atlanta. And I believe that was in like March that happened. And I know you said in an earlier conversation that this was really impactful to you, Kim. And I just wanted to make sure we had some time to talk a little bit about that and your experience as you were covering the story.
Yeah, it's this concept of invisible labor has come up a lot, especially as workplaces, as schools, as families are talking through often really uncomfortable conversations. And, you know, to some extent, maybe Kim and I did some invisible labor getting ready for this. You know, how can we translate our experiences and maybe temper some of these in a way that is going to, you know, maybe be unoffensive, in a way that's going to be understood, in a way that we won't be misunderstood. And it's not to say that this is bad work, but it's to, you know, it's just important to acknowledge that this is work that goes out there. And I thought of invisible labor a lot, particularly last year when there were all of the protests after George Floyd's murder. But I really thought about them more since 2015, because that was a period for me where I was constantly covering, it felt like every week I was covering a different shooting of a Black man or woman. And, you know, every once in a while talking with friends at work, with, you know, people in my community who were Black, you know, what that was like. You know, it was tragic and it was sad and it was difficult. But when talking to them, it was a different weight, because it was the feeling of, I saw a man be killed on camera and this man reminded me of my uncle, or now I worry about my son who is driving now. And these are fears that can really, they can really weigh you down. They play a real part in your, you know, physical health and your mental well-being. And then you go to work or you interact with people, and often there's an expectation that you just power through. And I had one friend confide to me that after he was pulled over by police during, you know, kind of like for no good reason on a reporting trip, when he went back to the office, the first response from his editor was, you know, are you still going to make deadline? It wasn't, are you okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? You know, do you need some time? And, you know, just there's constantly these factors that people are dealing with as, you know, more of these situations are in the news and being discussed. I mean, I definitely burned a lot of phone minutes calling all of my aunts, you know, across the US and saying, when are you getting groceries? You know, the ones that live in California, do you have a friend to go out with? You know, do you feel safe? You know, can you get deliveries to your building? And so for the spot shootings, that was such a strange time to be an Asian American woman working in breaking news. I've covered shootings, I can't even count how many, so this wasn't new. But if you remember in following that news, how much tension there was over the motives that the police said were the motives of the alleged shooter. And it came down to this idea that, these spas were a place of sexual temptation, which kind of goes back to some of what I had mentioned in the history of this, ongoing stereotype of Asian women in particular as both servile and, maybe over-sexualized, but also nameless. So there are these dynamics that I'm kind of bracing, and my other colleagues at work, the few Asian colleagues at work, were bracing and wondering, how is this story going to play out? How are people going to react to this story? And then how are we going to write this story? And I don't think anybody at work would mind me saying this, but at one point I saw some of our early coverage go up, and I immediately wrote a memo and I said, I'd like to ask that we be thoughtful about the language that we use in describing these businesses, because why are we describing these businesses as a massage parlor, which is, mostly a denigrating term, and one that's very loaded, versus describing these as spas or what they are. They were Asian-owned businesses, or just businesses in suburban Georgia. Why did the first thing that everybody went to in the first draft of their coverage, why was it massage parlor? Because that creates a very different, that creates a very different idea. And, in journalism in particular, we are trying to be as fair and impartial as possible. And massage parlor does put a thumb on the scale. That does give an insinuation and a texture to this place that we're describing when, we don't know if these were businesses that provided any kind of sexual services. We don't know if they were a place that people just went and got their nails done. We don't know anything about the status of the people who worked there or anything about the people who were killed. And the sadness from that too really, drove a lot of us to want to make the coverage better. The Asian American Journalists Association, the website crashed within the first day of posting a guide about a guide to Korean and Chinese names, to help people understand surnames, to help them understand pronunciation, and to give context as to, why it might be difficult, more difficult than it is usually, to get information about the victims. It's not because all they did was work. It's not because they didn't have interesting interior lives, but it could be that they didn't have a lot of friends who spoke English. And so the people that reporters would usually talk to were not accessible to them, or maybe most of their family was abroad. There's also cultural things about, privacy and about grief. And these are all things that, it hints to the strength and the importance of a diverse and representative newsroom, a diverse and representative workplace, because there weren't enough of us at my workplace to do all the work that needed to be done. And it was really crushing at times to feel the responsibility to get this coverage right for the victims and for the community and for our own sense of pride and our own sanity. And it would have been so much easier if, we had more maybe people in leadership who understood that, or if we were more empowered to take over. I'm really proud of the Post. They immediately took the memo, and it immediately took effect in our coverage. And they were really receptive to all of the guidance that the Asian American reporters were putting in. And, that felt really good, but it was also a really difficult time, and it was really draining. And I was definitely considering things that were truly going to make the coverage better. My colleagues and I were considering things that were going to make the coverage better, make the coverage more accurate, more useful to readers, that frankly our other non-Asian colleagues just wouldn't know to consider. And so that goes back to that week. It took me 3 weeks to recover from 1 week of reporting. And that was not the case for other reporters who worked on that. And so it's always, I think, important to recognize when there is sort of an extra burden that is being borne. And the number of other reporters, particularly Black reporters, friends who had been through this the previous year, who reached out and just said, "I'm thinking of you," or "How are you doing?" was really meaningful. So if you want to be a supportive person, if you want to be an ally in your workplace, sometimes just seeing and recognizing that that labor is happening or that that burden is being carried, just recognizing it can go a really, really long way. And I think it really improved a lot of my relationships, professionally, to be open and vulnerable about that. So these are often awkward conversations, but they're really worthwhile to have. With that.
Well, can I just add to that though?
Oh, yeah.
I'm really proud of you that you did that and that you stepped up and said, hey, we just need to be thinking about this a little bit more, how we're reporting it. One other thing I think, that we wanted to share was really just how large the Asian population is here in the United States. And I think the statistics were that the last census said that between 2000 and 2019, the Asian population grew 81% from 10.5 million to 18.9 million people here in the US. Also going back to something, that you were talking about, Kim, that there's 50 ethnic groups, I believe, and they're speaking about 100 different languages and multiple different religions within this group as well. So just all of the things that you were saying, right? It is, I think that it is a reminder that it isn't one population that we're speaking to when we're addressing the Asian community. I mean, it is very diverse even within itself.
A really quick shameless plug. A colleague at the Post just published a really excellent profile of Andrew Yang, who people will know as a unsuccessful Democratic presidential candidate who's now running for mayor of New York City. And that is not relevant to anybody living in West Michigan, but it is a fascinating profile because it gets into all of these things of Asians not being monolithic, of model minority groups, of being considered a perpetual outsider, and of how large the diaspora is and how, this is a very visible Asian figure right now, and just seeing the conversation around it of who supports him, who doesn't, and why for both really is a nice primer for just saying like, the stereotypes are really going to, don't serve anybody well, because there is such a huge array of political ideologies, of religious beliefs, of, cultural attitudes. And it's so worthwhile to try and spend some time with those and understand those better. And that's why, if you feel yourself thinking, I have one Asian friend, you got to stop yourself, because that will not tell you the whole story. So I'm going to just nod to that as some outside reading for anybody who's interested. I'll try and drop a link to that. But Kim, you were taking us on to our next discussion topic.
Yeah, and I think, part of the reason that we are here today is to talk about the rise in Asian hate crimes. For many of us who are Asian, just going back to in the beginning of COVID, Asian Americans were sharing with each other videos. And for me, as reflecting back into it, it really started with exposure to public confrontations. And I think we would see videos of, people in restaurants telling Asians to go back to Wuhan, or, just like basically, saying, hey, COVID is your fault. Like, we don't want you here in this country. And then as time's gone by, this is really manifested into actual violent crimes, which when you reflect back to where it began, and I even at one point was reflecting on myself and maybe with some friends that if somebody came up to me in a restaurant and said that to me, I don't even know what my reaction would be, to be quite honest. It would be very just shocking and startling. And I know that a lot of people were victim to that earlier on as we were trying to deal with COVID. But Kim, I think we just need to talk a little bit about what the bill is about. There has been over 6,600 hate crime incidences that have been documented since March of 2020. And I think one of the fear is because of the language barrier, there's probably a lot more that we're not familiar with that are happening. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this hate crime bill and, your thoughts related to it?
Yeah. If you subscribe to any news sites, you probably got all the push alerts on your phone a few weeks ago about a newly enacted federal hate crime law. It is specific to anti-Asian crimes and the pandemic, which is an important thing. It's called an anti-Asian hate crime bill, kind of a shorthand, but this is very specifically centered around the pandemic. What this law is going to do is it's going to establish a position within the Justice Department, someone who reports directly to Attorney General Merrick Garland, and it's going to focus on collecting data about anti-Asian hate crimes related to COVID-19 and allocate, different resources that's going to improve state and local reporting. So it's, in a sense, for anybody who works with the federal government ever and knows how there has to be some approval or legislation or vote to create any new thing, this is creating a role, and it's creating kind of a template and essentially a new lane for this information to travel and for this information to be investigated. Overarching hate crime legislation and hate crime investigation at the federal level is just a really tricky thing because, one of the criticisms is that it's subjective. That's like both true and not true, but it is complex. And so this law carves out something very specific because it's about a very timely issue, which is a rise in anti-Asian, what they call bias crimes sometimes, that is directly related to another event, which is the pandemic. And so this law is creating a space for this particular cause and particular effect. And hopefully, it looks like we're going to have some time, hopefully, to get to questions. But there's, I would say the law is far from comprehensive. There's questions of, does this just really push the issue onto police and saying, arrest more people for committing these crimes? I think that crime statistics will show that we can't arrest our way out of problems. They need to be fixed on a more systemic level. There are root causes. You can't just, round up one person who, beats an elderly Asian person in San Francisco and think that it's legitimately chipping away at the problem. So there are certainly limitations to what this can do. Also, there's a question of how immediate the impact is. My immediate impact is if my mom goes to the grocery store and somebody wants to spit at her, this hate crime law is not going to do anything preventative. This is very reactionary, as a lot of laws are. But, there is also a lot of excitement because it shows the political organization and the political power of Asian Americans who got together and fought for this and pressured Congress to get this passed. So that is also a win and kind of punctures this idea of Asians as not politically active and not politically galvanized. And there's a lot of attitude too that even this law itself and pushing for this law is Asian Americans showing that, they're going to stand up and they're going to fight back. And it rejects this notion of, this passive head down, not going to complain about anything idea that is, pretty harmful that's out there. And Kim, you had some personal experience with this. Not with the bill, but with the, with the concerns.
Yeah, I mean, it is, I think it is going back to living the difference, right? I was actually recently in the Bay Area and, where a lot of these hate crimes were reported. And it was a different experience versus the last time that I was in the Bay Area. Not only is downtown San Francisco, vacant right now because so many people are still working at home, that there was a little bit more of an eerie feeling walking on the streets. There, homeless population is definitely on the rise, which also, assuming that a lot of those individuals are dealing with mental health issues, right? It also created sort of that eerie feeling as you were walking through the streets. As we quickly, emerged into Chinatown, definitely a different feeling. And then as you go into some of the more touristy areas, it's not, that same feeling as well. But, Yeah, I would, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that walking through San Francisco this time, just understanding the hate crimes that have been going on in the area, it did make you feel different as an Asian versus when I had visited the city before. So I think we just have a few more minutes. Kim, I don't know if you have any closing comments that you want to make, or if we wanted to take some time for questions. Bob, why don't you just let us know?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we haven't gotten any questions yet, but I would, at this point right now, I don't know if anyone had thought about it. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A now. We have a few minutes left, and I'll give each of the ladies some time for closing comments as well. But before we get there, I really just want to thank you both so much for this conversation. I think it was great. It was really thoughtful. I mean, there was so many things that you said that spurred thoughts in my head, and I just really appreciate it. So with that, I know Kim, Bellware, you were about to speak kind of in terms of closing comments, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just kind of my parting thought was, where the momentum around this goes, and I think any kind of solution for change is going to take a lot of, people being willing to learn and willing to, kind of realign some ideas and understandings that they had. And that's okay. And it's not always comfortable, but that this is how we grow and how we get better. And one of the things that I saw emerging from this new attention to the lives and the experiences and the history of Asian Americans was a somewhat local one, which is the story of Vincent Chin, who you may have heard of because it has been coming up more now in the news and in popular culture. But this is a story that happened in Detroit almost 40 years ago, and I would guess that the majority of people had not heard of it. And Chin was a Chinese-American auto worker. He was out with friends at a strip club before his wedding, and two white auto workers who had been laid off in a redundancy beat him to death. They thought he was Japanese, and kind of, took out the anger of the, success of the Japanese auto industry, which they perceived as causing them to lose their jobs. They took this out on Vincent, who was not Japanese, but, this is happening at the backdrop of the oil crisis where, imported cars from, Japan and South Korea are really dominating the market. We're hurting the big three in Detroit. And at trial, the two men, a father and a stepson, they were able to plead their charges down to manslaughter. They got a $3,000 fine and no prison time. And so it just, this was such a big incident that happened in the state that I grew up in, and I didn't even know about it until the past few years. And I think there's now probably all sorts of things in the media in development, podcasts and TV series and things like that. But it was interesting in how that was kind of the bridge between the first 100 years of the Asian experience in the U.S. of kind of blaming this foreigner for taking things away or bringing bad things into the country. And, it's kind of always have to be mindful of this history that we're living in.
Well, what I like about that example too, Kim, is going back to something that Kim McLaughlin talked about earlier, right? Is this seeing the group as a monolith, right? So the Asian person who is out to dinner and someone screams, "Go back to Wuhan." I mean, if you think about it from the sense of, if I was living abroad in France and someone was like, "Go back to Vancouver," or even more so, "Go back to Guadalajara," because it's all in the same, continent. It seems ridiculous, but yet you hear about this sort of thing happening all the time. Like, person could be, "I can't find Wuhan on a map, much less go back there. What are you talking about?" But that goes to that concept of everyone, it's Asian, it's all the same, and the problems that come along with that. So a question did come in, a few of them. So one is thoughts on why the rise in Asian hate crimes, or is it even a rise, or has it always been high and we're just talking about it more now in media and media platforms?
think there's a lot of things going on with it, and some of it is pandemic related and some of it's misinformation related. We're just dealing with a completely different information ecosystem than we used to because of social media. You know, something that was written into a lot of the stories on when the anti-Asian hate crime legislation passed was that it was most of the opposition. It was a very bipartisan bill, but the small opposition did come from Republicans, and some of the complaints was that they felt this bill was kind of, you know, being unfairly used to make them look bad because a lot of leaders in the Asian American community had pointed to comments from former President Trump and other officials in the administration who said things like China virus, Wuhan virus. A lot of scholars who studied that said that's, you know, the reason why we shouldn't name pandemics and diseases related to places. You know, the history of the Spanish flu became what it was because nobody wanted to admit to having it in the country. And so then Spain was the only one that openly talked about it. And now it's the Spanish flu and not, the European, flu or wherever it is. So there are definitely a lot of discussions that this has been because of some of it is political. It is because China is seen as a rival and, kind of a hostile country to the U.S. And so it is easy to tie problems to the government, to the Communist Party. But the problem with that is when it gets filtered out into, mass media, most people, if they say something that's anti-China or anti-Chinese or anti-Asian, they're not really being specific if they're talking about Kim or if they're talking about me or if they're talking about, the government of a specific country. But the other thing is that we've seen this during pandemics in general. There's a long history of trying to trace the origins of a pandemic to a person or a group. Typhoid Mary, bubonic plague that started in San Francisco's Chinatown. And they're scary and uncertain times, and it helps people make sense of kind of unknowable situations if they can pinpoint its cause. And scapegoats, throughout history have just been really effective as a way to help people make sense. Even if they're wrong, it's a way that people can organize the information about what's happening to them.
So two things on that as a follow-up. One is, as a reporter, this is, in fact, there is a rise. It's not just more coverage. There has
Right.
a spike, is it correct?
Yes, there definitely is a rise. And that is because we're seeing things that, some of it is that we're in situations that didn't exist before. We didn't have mask policies. And so you don't see reactions, to mask policies and people wearing masks. Very early in the pandemic, I think maybe in March of 2020, there was already a lot of bias incidents that were happening in California when, nobody was going to Chinatown. That was like kind of the first sign. And there was some really good stories in the LA Times that talked about how other groups did not like seeing Asian Americans in, the LA area wearing masks because they thought it was fear mongering. Culturally, that's something that people have been doing for almost 20 years, since at least SARS, if not before. But it wasn't familiar here until we had the pandemic hit our shores. But there is a lot of attention that's undeniable, but a lot of it is very directly tied to the pandemic and matters of politics.
So I had some other thoughts, but I want to get to, there's another question here that I think is a good one from someone who is a school administrator that I know actually. And her question is, what do you see as the most impactful thing that K-12 schools can do to create and expand our students' learning and thinking? In other words, what would you hope K-12 schools would do?
So, I'm not an educator, nor am I going to pretend to be an expert on giving advice in this space. But I most recently just with Memorial Day, right? And people for the first time openly talking about what happened in Tulsa back in the 1920s. I just think, right, like history, as Kim was saying, when they took pictures of, people working on the railroads and they asked the Asian people to step out of the pictures, like I don't know what the answer is, but I do feel, like our history has a lot more to it. And, when I was in school, I never learned about half of the things that I'm hearing today. And so I don't know what the answer is to that, but I do feel like we need to go back into history and really take a look at what was happening in our country from different lenses.
And sort of what we had talked about earlier in the conversation of, color, saying that you don't see race or that you're colorblind not being helpful. You don't want that to be a reason that you treat people badly, but it's helpful to understand those experiences. And I'm thinking if you're working with young students in a curriculum, I used to work in arts education at Chicago Public Schools, and a lot of it's just embedding it into everything and making it normal. So if you are doing a unit about food, maybe include foods that are from other countries. If you're studying, music, we do this all the time in reporting. I try and look and see, are my sources representative? Am I only talking to one kind of person? Am I only talking to men for science stories? Am I only talking to women for education stories? Really making sure that the sources are representative. I think that it's great to have a dedicated month or a curriculum, but I think it should be all year round. The thing that I go back to, and this kind of like ties in a lot of things of stereotypes and model minorities. There's this expectation that, at least in the 80s, you're going to become doing something in math and science. And there is a very well-known bad at math to journalism pipeline, which I'm part of because I'm terrible at math. And I wanted to be a musician. And when we started this call, I was talking about a punk group of young Chinese and Latino girls in California that are, were making waves. And when the guitarist Eddie Van Halen died last year, I didn't find out until his obituary that he was half Indonesian. And if someone had told me as a kid that like one of the best rock gods of all time was like Asian, that would have gone a long way to making me feel like I can see myself in some of these spaces. And so I think for kids, it's helping them in everything that you teach, in the authors of books that you read, in the people who are represented in the stories. Just be inclusive. I think that can be an easy way to do it, because if you work in education, I'm sure you know that getting big curriculum changes can be a huge lift, but a lot of just what you pick on your own as far as the information that you bring into the classroom, making sure that is really representative and diverse can go a long way.
Well, thank you both so much. I could sit here honestly and ask you questions for the next hour, but I know we're out of time and I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I am so grateful that you both took the time to do this and to be with us and have this conversation. So thank you very much from me and everyone else at Miller Johnson.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Bob.